Hello there, and welcome to the Traveller in the Evening podcast, hosted by me, Andy Wilson. I'm really pleased to have tonight's guest with us, but more about them in just a moment, because first of all, I'd like to ask you, while you're listening in, why not get across to Traveller in the Evening, or one word, no spaces. So, travellerintheevening.com. Get over there and you can take out a free subscription to the blog, so you'll get updates about whatever we're up to. You can also consider taking out a paid subscription, which would support our work. So thanks for even thinking about that. Having said that, I'd now like to welcome tonight's guest, Timothy Morton. I'm especially excited to have Tim with us. I interviewed them last month on behalf of the Blake Society. Tim gave a tremendous presentation of the main ideas in the book. But I invited them to follow up, as it were, so that maybe we could push the discussion further. Who knows? Let's find out. I first came across Tim's work as a result of the Blake Society a couple of years ago, when the Society had an issue of its journal, Vala, especially about Blake and nature. And as part of writing an article about that, I was sort of genning up on contemporary thinking on ecology and came across Tim's work. Now, Tim's work is heavily informed by contemporary currents in philosophy, in particular object-oriented ontology. More about that later, I'm sure. But the point is that his work is deeply informed by that. And yet when I read it, I was struck by how it seemed to me compatible with William Blake's view of the world, William Blake's way of seeing things. And that's an extraordinary thing to say, really, because Blake's way of seeing things has been pretty much completely at odds with received wisdom ever since his time. He was in favour with the counterculture, of course, in the 60s. But even then, his thought wasn't always really that well understood. And so it was a surprise to me how deep a connection there seemed to be between Tim's object-oriented ontologist view of climate change and Blake's general view of nature. So that was a surprise. But when I heard about a year ago that Tim was extending this to talk specifically about Blake, I was pretty excited for reasons you can guess. But then on top of that, it turned out that Tim was basically coming out as a Christian, and after many years as a Buddhist, he'd had some kind of conversion experience and become a Christian. And that excited me even more, because I'd found myself, having come from an atheist, secularist kind of view, coming from that kind of background, the more I've engaged with Blake, the more I've left that behind me. And I found there's no great conversion. I sort of settled into what I saw as Blake's Christian view of the world, an unorthodox view in many ways, but certainly a Christian view, contrary to what a lot of people will tell you. So when I heard that Tim's new book would be written from a Christian point of view, written hand in hand with William Blake, and that it would apply the ideas of object-oriented ontology, that really got my attention. So I was excited about the whole idea of the book. And having had the chance to read it prior to its release, which is a little after this podcast is broadcast, so that's May 2024. So the book is due to be published any moment. But having had the chance to read it, I was astonished at the depth and radicalism of Tim's views, and again, how deeply they chimed with the views of William Blake. So that's the background to tonight's discussion. As I say, I interviewed Tim on behalf of the Blake Society last month about his new book, and he spoke in the broadest terms about the book, and it was an amazing meeting. But I'll put a link to that on the page for the podcast on the Traveller in the Evening, so you can see all of that. So in inviting Tim onto this podcast, I wanted to extend the discussion to some extent, but also to drill a bit more deeply into a few issues in particular that struck me. Sorry for such a long-winded introduction, but I wanted to try and frame and explain, my personal enthusiasm for Tim's work. So what I wanted to do to start with was mention what I proposed as the title for this meeting, and why I chose it as the title. So the title is Timothy Morton's Hell, Throwing a Wrench of What the Fuck into the Machine. And what it was I was looking for a racier title than, Andy interviewed
Great.
Tim, and I opened the book and flicked through it a bit, and I was reading a bit about Thel, and I didn't quite understand what it meant, so I'll read the bit to you, and I'll
oh, wonderful. That's wonderful.
What I read was this. It said, and it's talking about the Book of Thel, obviously. It says, the non-cloning part of our biosphere, the way it appears, from flowers to wallpaper to disco balls to iridescent beetles, is a reflection of queer desire without a goal. And then it says, Thel created Earth. So Thel is a figure for theory, throwing a wrench of what the fuck into the machinery. And therefore, Thel is a figure for life, but not the procreative, goal-directed life of parents and daughters. Wonderment is the feel of theory, and it goes on. So I got the idea of, of queer desire and theory. And then I connected that with what I thought about the book, reading it, which is that it was written in a different way to your other books. And it seemed motored almost from the beginning by, not at the one end, your enthusiasm, but at the other hand, by your experience of trauma as a child. So I just wanted to throw that back at you and say, what are you getting at?
Yeah. I'm glad this is the topic for the day. Just from a purely sort of personal, emotional point of view, and the book is, as you say, very personal and emotional. I've actually been feeling very sort of angry today. I woke up feeling angry with myself, and then it turned into angry with other people. And, in the spirit of I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I'm sort of, now that I've been, whatever that is, I'm just going to come out and say it if people don't already know, either born again Christian. And I'm finding my strong negative feelings, and there are a lot of them, really much easier to tolerate. I noticed that, like in Buddhist circles, there is a certain way in which some people involved in other religions, such as Christianity, also have issues with negative feelings, and they get into the religion thinking, at last, a chance for me never to have to feel angry again, for example. It's a big, strong thing about Buddhism, is that a lot of Buddhists are very angry, very upset people who don't want to feel that way. Buddhism is about becoming a Buddha. It's not about becoming, not angry, right? And Buddha can get angry, right? Jesus got angry. And, in particular, there's nothing in particular wrong with a negative emotion. It's one thing I learned in Buddhism. There's something wrong with aggression, right? But you can be angry without aggression. Although, of course, acting it out is enacting the anger as opposed to acting out the aggression gets a little tricky, and until you're a completely enlightened Buddha, you probably want to refrain from the kind of no, stop sort of thing. But by that point, you're basically Neo, and you can stop bullets from hitting you by just saying no, so it doesn't really matter anymore. But yeah, I got mad actually about publicity. Unlike your good self, who, like me, has this beautifully homegrown thing that they're doing. I don't have an agent, folks. I have someone who's helping me with the publicity for this book, but I've never had an agent. I've never had any success getting an agent. And yet, sometimes people want me to put myself out there for their benefit, and it just became clear that something in the world was doing that right now, and that something was related to someone about whom I have sometimes negative, sometimes very positive feelings, and who's a friend of mine, and will inevitably start talking about Slavoj Žižek anyway, so I might as well just bring his name up. He's actually going to be in this thing called Where the Light Gets In, which is a festival of art and ideas run by the ICA in Y, and everyone's kind of setting up camp for that right now. And I wish I was there. I was invited to do it, and then COVID happened. So I'm very jealous of Slavoj. I'm just going to say, I'm just going to come out and say these feelings. And Slavoj, of course, has just published a book about Christianity, and I've published a book about Christianity. And I promise you, Andy, that we're getting around here to the point, which is essentially wonderment, right? Adding into the mix here, so wonderment is part of this feeling or feel or phenomenology, if you want to use that word, of the thing that Peter Otto calls holiness. Right, you've got what does he say? It's a mystery, both awesome or fearful and wondrous. Right, in Latin, it's mysterium tremendum et fascinans, and whatever that is, right? Like so I actually I believe in a kind of sciencey, trusting way, right, that there is such a thing as charisma. You know, I've met people with real charisma, right? Like, for example, Tibetan Rinpoche. Rinpoche is a Tibetan word for reverend, you know, and those guys, you can learn charisma. That's the interesting thing. You can learn it. It's not just something that you happen to have. It's not necessarily something that, you know, you just happen to be born with. Like, you're an aristocrat by birth, and, you know, if you're allowed to be the boss of everybody. You can actually sort of learn it. You can also unlearn it, and you can misuse it. Right. The previous president of the USA is heavily misusing all kinds of charisma that they may have learned just to kind of survive the NPD that they've got. But whatever, Rinpoches, such as my meditation teacher Sogni Rinpoche, they are exuding a kind of wonderful, wondrous, wonderment inspiring thing. It's not even a feeling. It's more like what we would call an affect or a feel. It's like a sensation. You know, I felt the same thing with Björk. You know, I'm in the studio with Björk, and there's Arca, and she's saying, you know, Björk is the soul opener, unquote. And I'm like, yeah, you know, and she's a healer. Yes, you know, that she's. I'm going to describe it. It's like a sort of sphere of lovely, benevolent, healing energy that's about 3 to 4 foot radius outside of her body, and you want to be in it. You want to be inside it. Everybody wants to come close to Björk and just be like inside that thing. And I met this wonderful guy from the Vatican. Please forgive me for forgetting his name. I was at the Nobel Institute just before COVID happened, and we were talking about global warming with quote unquote religious leaders from Judaism and Islam and indigenous traditions and Hinduism and so forth and so on. And this one guy, Joshua, actually, who's his first name, works at the Vatican. Also, this 3 foot radius, beautiful, whatever that is, sphere, cloud of something. You just wanted to be close to the guy, you know. And I met Desmond Tutu. I was working as a library porter at Lambeth Palace Library in 1985, and in came a car, and Desmond Tutu was in the passenger seat of the car. And the first thing he did, he come in the library there into the sort of front forecourt there, and he leans out of the car and he gives me a hug. He doesn't know who I am, you know. And there's this incredible, like, he's got this energy coming out of him, you know. And in that very same year, it turns out Jerry Falwell, who everybody knows, I hope, went to South Africa and came back basically to say that the Reagan Thatcher people should appease the apartheid, you know, government there. And he described Desmond Tutu as a phony. Now, this guy was actually radiating this wonderment, right? This wondrousness, yeah. And in order to describe the guy as a phony, I'm assuming Falwell must have met with him, so he experienced that. So he had to suppress or delete or pretend that didn't happen. To him, that thing that happens when you're within a few feet of someone who's got that charisma, you know, and that takes a demonic level of aggression to withstand. So, you know, cut to the other part of this, right, which is about Slavoj. Because, you know, one of the first things I read in Zizek's work was that charisma is a thing that people lend to other people. It's not a phenomenon like I'm describing. It's something that you lend to the person, right? So the king has kingly power because people have lent the king that charisma. It's something that he's gotten from Hegel, right? And so I can deduce from this that Slavoj has possibly never been around someone with that level of whatever that is, or, and I can't imagine that this is true, has a tin ear for it. And those are a shame, you know. And this would be why, in a way, Slavoj says that the Holy Spirit isn't really a thing. It's the feelings of the community of believers. You know, in a way, it isn't a thing, and yet it's the only real thing, right? It's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's nothing there. Even that guy says, you know, everything else he said must have just been a bit rubbish, but that he said that it was great in extremis, you know. And then what we've really got is the revolutionary vibe of the community of apostles, right? As Zizek describes it. And this feeling that they're having is something that they've got, this feeling of solidarity, basically. And it's even that isn't really a thing, right? Like when you study it, it's not wondrous. It doesn't have, if charisma isn't a thing, then this feeling is very abstract, right? It's what I'm trying to get to here. And I guess it's the main difference between the book that I wrote about Christianity, the same time as Zizek published a book about Christianity, which for Zizek, there's no there. And yet it's a great way to truly be a materialist. And I know what he means in some sense, actually, and hopefully we'll get to that. But for me, there really is a there. And a lot of this born again, it's an experience that I started having at 6 p.m. on March the 28th, 2023. I was serving these vegan meatballs to my son Simon, and suddenly, poof, you know, whatever that is, it involves the internal, or whatever that means, sort of it wasn't cooked up by some guru, basically, whatever that is, you know, it was cooked up by God. So it's not necessarily internal, and I'm not really even experience it as like in my body in particular, but it is as a feel and affect, a kind of transpersonal, boundary violating sensation of extreme benevolence.
What that makes me think of is something else in your book, where you talk about the Just Stop Oil women who, you know, threw tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers, and you compare it to the Sex Pistols on the Grundy show. And the reason I mention that is that one of the things I can never explain to younger people is punk rock. And if I talk about the Sex Pistols, young people say, well, sell out, Johnny Rotten, Trump. And I can't communicate to them this feeling at that time of seeing a tear almost in the sort of curtain of reality, and something was there and it was palpable. But how do you communicate? And I think that's connected. I mean, I'm not talking specifically about charisma, but I think it is something to do now, I would say, with the Holy Spirit, and that is, you know, a very real thing. So you're talking about the charisma of the individual. But we started by talking about theory, you know, the word theory as it crops up in your discussion of Thel. And I feel that kind of animating force in some of your writing. I don't want to be too happy-clappy, but it just seems very different to what I have experienced of theory. So when I respond to your work, like, some of them get quite, I mean, I come from a kind of Marxist activist background, so I know a lot of those people. And, you know, I read what they say, and some of them are old friends, but, you know, all that world is kind of behind me now. But they get really angry about some of this stuff, and they seem to have none of that. They don't seem to recognize this force within theory. And it does seem like a tuning in problem, or, you know, they seem not only not to have tuned in, but to be desperately trying to keep the dial somewhere else. You know?
It's so ironic. Thank you for saying all this. To go back to punk, for one delightful moment, or two, or three, or five, and I'm so glad you forced me to talk about punk. The last time we spoke, Andy, we ended up talking about prog, much to your chagrin, you say. So we'll go to the punk place here. In a way, you could argue that what they did on the Bill Grundy show was only charisma. I mean, they were saying all kinds of words like, you know, you dirty fucker, right? And all they had, right, what the Sex Pistols had was just the charisma, right? Like, let's make a skirt out of a bin bag. What you've got there is just charisma, right? Like, let's make a conversation out of rude words. What you've got there is just charisma, you know? And in a funny way, like, of course, it is the Holy Spirit, right? And it is, in a funny way, it is related to what you're talking about, because, you know, so I wrote this book called, about Marxism. I wrote this book called Humankind, where I was basically saying Marxism needs a good old fecal transplant of what is called anarchism by Marxists, right? Like communism that we don't like because it isn't Marxist, basically. And it needs this. And why does it need it? In particular, it needs it because of this feeling in a certain way, right? Like the feel of communism is lost a little bit. Solidarity is a feel, right? But above and beyond a choice, it's like, why do you even want to choose it? Because it's a feeling. It's a solidarity is a feeling. And the subtitle of the book is the definition of the feelings. It's solidarity with non-human people, right? And we could sort of go into that, but basically, what's interesting for me as a theory, I'm a theory student, Andy. I'm an A plus, I'm an alpha plus theory student. When I was at Oxford, I did my exam. It's ridiculous. They have this Greek sort of system, right? And you know, the highest you can get is alpha minus. Nobody gets it. It's alpha minus, and then it's alpha minus question mark, you know, alpha minus question mark minus, alpha double minus question mark. Need I go on? It's ridiculous. They should just do numbers. I got alpha plus. Nobody gets alpha plus. I got alpha plus on my theory exam because people were blown away by the theories. So I know theory. I know Hegelian Marxism. I can destroy people using Hegelian Marxism. I have done it. I did it in my early 20s. Where does it come from? This funny. You're right that because you see. So I'm a Terry Eagleton student as well, and it's like that guy was a Catholic, but never let on that he was, and was also incredibly hostile to theory, but in a funny way never let on that he was either. And like his book Literary Theory is a massive diss track in the name of a certain kind of Marxism, you know. And I think about it, and forever I've tried to think about, you know, how do we make this actual real world a better place for people. And so I think about it very seriously, you know. Am I squaring a circle by wanting to join these things up in my head, the sort of mysticism part of me and the sort of socialist part of me, you know? So I'm just going to say a thing now, and you know, maybe it's incorrect, but this is my latest sense of it, right? Somebody's style is not superficial to what they're saying. Somebody's style, especially if they're not very explicit about it, can be absorbed by the listener, reader, hearer. We were just talking about it. Charisma is a style, and you can learn that style. Actually, you can learn to be more attractive. You can actually, in a demonic way, you can sort of magnetize people. And it's kind of like, from my point of view, because I learned to do this. I had the worst acne when I was a teenager, and the first ever keynote I gave, I was terrified. I was totally cotton mouth, white as a sheet, shaking. I'm a PTSD survivor with complex PTSD. I shouldn't be this anything. I shouldn't have a house. I feel like I shouldn't have money. I shouldn't have any, let alone any success. I should be like totally homeless or sort of like on the street or something. I shouldn't be where I'm at. I really shouldn't. You know, is the thought inside my head. How am I doing it? It's like I'm letting people enjoy whatever it is they think I am. And that sort of letting people in quality is like the starter solution for this charisma thing. You just sort of let people enjoy you. You know, it's what I say to poor job candidates in my profession, where they're going up against hundreds of people and they visit a campus and they have to impress people. And I'm like, just let them lead. Just let other people love you. Just let them get into you, whatever they want, you know. And that's sort of like the beginning of it. And in a way, there is a sort of Holy Spirit thing going on there, where you're just allowing people to enjoy you. There is a certain kind of, it's not passive, but it's not very much active either. So to come back to this thing about style being very important, right? Karl Marx was a famous misanthrope, right? Like even his best friends couldn't believe how mean he was to people. He was so mean. And what if this misanthropy actually got into, because he was so mean, it must have gotten into like the sentence level, right? So a lot of what people are transmitting, I'm so sorry to do this. And of course, everyone's going to kill me now but that's going to prove my point. I'm so sorry, but they're going to be like, oh, you haven't read the manual properly. You don't really understand the Hegelian blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, I don't. But this still is proving my point, right? Which is that there is a certain way in which that gets absorbed and then retweeted, right? Like as a way to be right, as a way to be sure of yourself, right? Now let's think about the academy in the 70s and 80s. I came into theory world in the 80s, right? And let's think about religion, actually. Let's think about my best friend, one of my best friends, Alan. I met Alan in Oxford. I was at a party, I was pretty high. I was hearing this guy talking about doing peyote with his mum. And I, for my sins, had just done acid with my dad, you know. And so I was like, wow, this guy, I can't believe it. There's somebody talking about doing psychedelics with their parent. So I made friends with him, and it turns out he was a Tibetan Buddhist, right? And he was part of the gay community in Boulder, Colorado, with whom I was and am very connected, yeah, welcomed in. And like a lot of people, Alan's from Kentucky and he'd run away from Christianity and from his parents. And, you know, went to New York, worked with Andy Warhol, and then he got into the Buddhism. And of course, like people in that era, absolutely running away like the clappers from Christianity, right? Like the other thing that's a very powerful influence on my life, that's also part of Alan's world, the house music scene, which is in the book, right? Alan was and is a DJ. During COVID, he did these parties on Zoom. Alan's got purple lasers in his house. Do you know what I mean? Like Alan's really into it, you know. And that we're also talking there about gay black people in Chicago and Detroit creating a house for themselves that they can inhabit. That's why it's called house, right? And how that interfaces, to go back to punks again, with punks, you know, as I said to Björk, you know, house music was a lot of acid house was punks on ecstasy, wasn't it, Björk? And he says, yeah, well, we had to think of something to amuse ourselves with. And the interface between those two communities, right, creating house in Britain, and I'm from that era, and if it hadn't been for 1988, I would be a seriously messed up person. Like that actually gave me a kind of core, something to believe in, you know. And I've just befriended David Durrell, who's a major part of this book, to get permission to reproduce something that's in the frontispiece of the book, which is his flyer for this club, right? Why am I saying this? Because in theory class, there was an unwritten rule. You don't talk about religion. You assume a kind of atheism. I was talking about it with Daniel Pinchbeck, who is advocating the use of psychedelics and is a very interesting sort of public intellectual person, lives in New York City. And he said, growing up in New York City in the 1970s, there was a kind of default atheism. And it's like, of course, you don't want to mention these things that could piss off people who are dying of AIDS, like Alan's best friend, you know, like Foucault, Barthes, all these people who you're reading.
I don't know if people didn't want to piss somebody off, but you were just considered stupid if you mentioned religion. I remember a meeting I once went to of the group I was in, and we had a couple of people in the audience who were liberation theology sort of student young people from Latin America, very brave, very dedicated. And the meeting was given by my friend, and it was about religion and Marxism. And, you know, I helped my friend prepare the meeting. It was a great meeting. We had a lovely discussion. But 3/4 of the way into the discussion, suddenly one of the audience said, look, you know, put their hand up and said, look, at the end of the day, religion is bollocks. And what was interesting, the whole room, apart from me and a couple of liberation theologians, burst out laughing, like this great yawp of relief that they could say what they actually thought about it, that it was ridiculous, you know. And I've always found that really peculiar, just from an ordinary sort of analytical point of view of what that got me so frightened of.
Well, of course, may I? I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I beg your pardon. This is just very meaningful and very exciting for me. And I've just been reading, thanks to you, posting René Girard, right? And I would suggest that it's like that Girard quotation that you posted, namely that people reject religion in the key of religion. It's like Alice through the looking glass. You try to escape from the house only to find yourself coming back to the front door, right? And what that group did was to scapegoat something, which is your religion thing, and send it away, which is your religion thing, and to bond in a very narcissistic way in terms of inclusion, exclusion, which is a religion thing, over hating religion, which is a religion thing. You know, at least we're not like those stupid Buddhists. At least we're not like those stupid Christians. At least we're not like those stupid other people, right? Which is your basic primordial. This is the good side of religion, which is that it relates to, and the bad side. Yeah, we're talking about the bad side right now, but like the way that it relates to the horrible, nasty, primitive, are they even feelings? Because they have to do with deep, deep, deep life form sort of interface between the life form and what's inside the life form and what's outside the life form, right? And the whole trouble with the Marxism, you know, when it says, when the actual quotation that interestingly Eagleton always misquoted, and I think deliberately, or maybe unconsciously deliberately, he called it, Marx says religion is the cry of the heart in a heartless world. That's not what Marx says. Marx says religion is the heart of a heartless world. It's much meaner. It's laughing with contempt at the idea of this heartless world having a heart. It's like a fake, nasty. Terry Eagleton turned it into the cry of a heart in a heartless world, you know, which in a way it tells you everything you need to know about poor. I'm so sorry, but I feel sorry for people. You know, I feel sad for people. I feel sad for Slavoj. I feel sad for Terry, you know, and I feel sad for anyone who is literally in that moment. They're kind of crying themselves when they say Marx says religion is the cry of a heart in a heartless world, because actually Marx isn't saying that. Marx wants you to laugh at religion. Marx doesn't want you to sympathize. So you, as a Marxist who loves to express extreme contempt at people, are doing a really heavy Jerry Falwell level pirouette right there inside of yourself, let alone to other people, where you're basically just hitting delete on some very vulnerable, very real feelings that have to do, I would argue, with what we're talking about, which is the phenomenology of the Holy Spirit in one of its aspects, which is the wonderment, right? Like aggressively expressed contempt is absolutely the wonderment killer, you know. But if I was going to suggest something here about the Book of Fell, it would be that, funnily enough, when all of that noise died down in my head, you know, it took a long time for all of that noise to die, because I was such a survivor. I was trying to go with whatever group welcomed me in, and so being part of the contempt club, you know, I've been calling them Right Club recently, like Fight Club, right? The first rule of Right Club is you never mention Right Club. And the second rule of Right Club is you never mention Right Club. And as soon as you call them out, like, actually, we're in a church here. This is a church with St. Hegel, you know, with a sort of stained glass window of Marx, and you all are like crusading Inquisition people. They get so mad, you know. And the first time I ever said, you know, I'm not quite sure anymore about the concept of critique, I got killed in public for 3 days by people who had to perform a ritual sacrifice of me. And incidentally, by the way, I love a Theodor Adorno. I can do it. And I'm not even on that weird planet that I was on when I was quoting a lot of David Bohm.
So the group I was associated with, for those who care about this, which won't be many people, was the British Socialist Workers' Party. But one of my heresies was when they expelled me eventually, which is great because I'd been expelled from the military as well for opposition to the Falklands War.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Then I got expelled by the Trotskyist group, the SWP, for opposition to Lukács, which was bizarre. But if you'd have asked me earlier what I thought of Marx and religion, I'd have said that sometimes he is balanced, and you know the argument, right? That there's two sides to his formulation, which you're saying there isn't. But I'll reconnect with you over what you said about the style, because what I said to a friend of mine earlier this week, I said, if you did a kind of just a survey of what advertising people call my mind space over the last 20 years, you would probably find the biggest thing in it was my wondering how I ever put up with the stuff I used to put up with and not see it in that context, in a sense, because my friend came from the same background. So why were we like that? And part of it, what you said about Marx's style reminded me, I mean, as a marvelous, critic as he is, it reminded me of what I pick up most in my old friends' criticisms, which is Marxism gave them the ability to be right about everything, to shut you down and to always, and they didn't even have to know, the particular content of it. They could have a good guess from a Marxist point of view about why you were wrong about everything. And to me, that winds back to where we started here, is because where there's nothing in there of the kind of the wonderment of theory, the idea of theory as inspiration of, is there something more going on so that we don't want to be that close. But yeah.
Yes. 3 cheers, first of all, for anybody who manages to be ejected by the army, by the way, who first of all trying to be in it, which is admirable, right? Like, so my dad was the kind of anti-army person who would never, like his brother was in the army and he wasn't in the army, and to that extent he was and remained very militaristic, right? Interestingly, talking of what we were talking about, I myself was scapegoated on a retreat. I was on this 3-month meditation retreat in the Rockies. 400 people, mostly in their 20s, all of them but maybe 2, one of which was me, falling in love with this guru, and I'm not, right? And at the end, it was so hard to feel resisting and doubting, but I couldn't let go of those feelings. And it turned out many years later that the guy was a terrible Me Tooer, like really bad, like rape bad, like really, really bad, And that whole community had already been shredded by stuff that happened with the father of that guru's main guy in the 1980s. And like, I understand about being the scapegoat, and I'm afraid that I sort of enjoy it a bit, and I get paid to do it. I feel like I've turned what happened to me as a kid, which is that I got ostracized by my dad and my brothers, and into a thing that gets me paid. So now I just blatantly say the wrong thing in public and sort of get paid for it. And so I understand this energy, and I understand it's happened to me so many times. And I do it accidentally, even when I'm trying to be like sort of joining a group. I'll say a thing that is somehow really toxic for people, because that's the way I am as a sort of abuse survivor, but over time it's kind of like thinking about what religion is from a different perspective. Because of that is an incredible gift, like, so I had to quit from Christianity because I basically just felt like the devil. Talking of scapegoats, so I would go to church because all my school friends were like, we could get confirmed and go to church. So I spent a lot of my early teens doing this class A drug called church, and just ending up feeling like the devil because I could see around the arguments that were being made in the pulpit. I could see through it or around it, or see something around, or like have a funny feeling or a negative thought or whatever. And it was just like, and then to re-encounter that energy inside of Buddhism and realize, wow, actually, a lot of what people pin on Christianity isn't Christianity's fault. It's in particular, it's not Jesus's fault, because it's in Buddhism, actually. It's in Hinduism. It's everywhere. And right now in America, there's a lot of people leaving the evangelicals, right? They call themselves ex-evangelicals. And I just accidentally wrote a book for them because I didn't realize that was what it was. And conversely, in Britain, there's a lot of people flocking. I just discovered to my horror that Russell Brand is talking about Christianity on a regular basis.
In the Thames this week. That's right.
It's just like, what? So now yet again I find myself.
I used to spend a lot of time thinking, what must my old Marxist friends think of me? Now I talk about Christ and Jesus. I know what they think of me actually, but I know they think I must have gone completely mad or just turned some corner. And I sort of half felt like that myself, because I'm so jealous of you really for having a clear kind of conversion experience, a big, banging on the door sort of thing. Because I found that having come from that sort of background, I got into Blake and I read Blake and read Blake and read Blake. And I just sort of ended up being a Christian because I suddenly realized I was more radical than I'd ever been. But it only made sense from within this new Blake, what I gleaned from Blake, feeding my way into Blake. And so I sort of surprised myself. I'm like, well, I can't deny it that I'm a Christian. I don't know how I'm a Christian, so to say, but that's how it came about.
Can I just, for the listeners here, can I just do a shout out to our host here, because Andy has gone through and is going through what Badiou would call a truth process, absolutely, truly, properly, religiously, like letting himself be affected by stuff that he learns. And there's so much more to that than the way that I just said it, And first of all, I want to, this part of me just wants to say, I only got to this experience by doing a lot of, by being privileged enough to have the money to pay for 25-ish years of therapy. I did 25 years of therapy with a heavy duty guy who was also in the Buddhist community, name of Robert Unger, in Boulder, Colorado, psychoanalysis. And I was in group psychoanalysis with the guy because he was one of the leaders of the group psychoanalysis movement in the USA. And so I learned a lot of things about group dynamics, and I learned a lot of things about scapegoat, but I also learned in a very physical way a lot about myself, And about maybe 3 years before he retired, I had all the memories of the childhood that I'd been blocking, that I spent my entire life configuring myself around, And then after he'd retired, I went into EMDR therapy because of that, right? And one of the takeaways from this is that took me, it's actually 24 years of analysis. That took me 21 years, right? Like from a child's life plus a few years it took for me in analysis, paying for it. I paid this guy hundreds of thousands of dollars. Do you know what I mean? I paid him I paid him a lot of money every week to do this. And I only got to realizing what the hell had happened to me as a kid that was hiding in plain sight after 21 years of it. So I don't for a second, all I can do, Andy, with you is just like look at you in wonderment, talking of wonderment, and go, wow, you're a very special person, because you have allowed yourself to go through these things and be honest and like allow this stuff to happen. I had to have so much therapy just to get to the point where I could even verbalize it to myself.
Maybe I should explain that the reason I joined the Navy was because my father, and I think now I now think I'm autistic. So what happened was a conference. My father was very violent, rapist, gang leader, really a kind of person you would know. Okay, I know from your book that you would recognise the type, and he was like that. And I was failed at school because I passed the 11 plus and went to a kind of public grammar school on the other side of town, and there was no one from where I lived who went there. But I completely bombed at school, I think because of autism, I think now. And I just had to get away. And the reason I say all of that is that, however, wherever I ended up, part of it, something I detected in your book, and so I'll ask you outright about this. It seemed to me that, childhood trauma can lead you to develop a kind of, apart from all the troubles it gives you, it also gives you a kind of not a bullshit meter, but I've actually, in my review of your book, I've called it a hate-seeking monitor, right? You can see it a mile away. It's like I compared it to once I was very depressed, but then since then, every time I feel depression coming close, I've recognized it, and I get a bit scared because I can see it, and I feel like that about forms of oppression. I see a racist, when I get this thing rises that is very primordial, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that one of the reasons wherever I arrived at, one of the reasons I got there was tracking that in your book. In a sense, I can feel that. It seemed to me in your book that's what's driving things, and I think it's something that's well, I won't say any more about that, but that was my impression of your book, and what
that's absolutely
too,
I thank you for that. You know, there is a way in which being a survivor, you get these superpowers, you know, with all of the weird, freaky loneliness of the supposed superhero, unquote, brackets, exclamation mark, and the feeling that you're a bit of that you're a freak, you know. I could never, ever be the department chair. I could never be the dean. I'm very rarely somebody's first reader. I'm usually the second reader. It's usually a better position for me. And in the group, you know, and people may know this from my work, you know, but usually it's done with a lot of footnotes and very slowly, you know, like Ecology Without Nature, very slowly, gently, dog whistle, you know. Have you ever noticed that some ecological theory is a little bit, you know, misogynistic and racist, you know? I'm the assassin, you know, I'm the assassin. I see bad stuff and I stop it. You know, I strongly identify with, I'm the only person I know who watches the Daniel Craig James Bond films as a form of self-help, right? Like I can watch the first 10 minutes of Skyfall weeping, you know, and I look at Miss Moneypenny there with her gun pointing it, and I hear the things that she says as a kind of mystical statements about life. Like she says, negative, there's no time. You know, M says, can you get into a better position? And she's pointing the gun. She says, negative, there's no time. Like, yeah, that's exactly, there's no time, you know. And it's like, I see bad stuff and I stop it, you know. And this happens in my job, right? I'll say something, one thing I'll say in the group, whether it be online or whatever, and 2 months later, everyone's stopped it, whatever it is that I've said to stop. But I can't start stuff. I can't form consensus. I shouldn't come within 100 clicks of being the chair of anything, because you can't have the assassin as the chair.
I have
you
to
know,
mention,
but I do have a special set of skills, Andy, you know.
I have to mention to you that when I was expelled from the Trotskyist group, they did it because I was forming a journal called The Assassin. But I mean, we've talked for quite a while now, Tim. I wonder if I could just raise a couple of other things with you briefly,
Of course.
I promise. But one of them is that when all that happened and I got expelled, one of the things I'd realised, it was quite amazing actually. I read philosophy at university, and I was really interested in the philosophy of science, ontology, epistemology. I never thought about aesthetics, and then talking about, you know, being bad-tempered or whatever, I got this opportunity because they sacked me from my job. I had a job in this group. They sacked me, and they were feeling like they wanted to keep me on board. So they made me an offer. They said, at our next national conference, you know, sort of a week of debates and classes and things, you know, what do you want to talk about? And my nemesis had just brought out a book about aesthetics. It was actually about postmodernism. And I said, do you know what? I'd like to talk about postmodernism just to annoy this person, right? And but it meant I had to read about postmodernism and aesthetics. And suddenly something huge clicked with me, which was that aesthetics is really the key thing. Because in the world of theory, within this group, for example, we could all agree each other. The way I tell it is that we were always having meetings called things like, should the troops get out of Ireland? And everybody knew what the answer was. Everybody knew what the argument was, but you'd all sit there and go through it, and you all appeared to agree with one another. But in the pub afterwards, people would talk about art, and they were completely different people. And that was the only time I could get any sort of sense of who I was talking to, was when I knew how they responded to art and to aesthetics. I just mean silly things. I mean, the example I'm thinking of was a meeting about should the troops get out of Ireland, but it was followed by a discussion in the pub about is Madonna a good thing for women, empowering women, and you've got this mad debate. But the reason I ended up thinking it was important was because the theory guys didn't want to talk about that, because you can't control it. That's the point. You can't. I think actually it was Brecht once said this to Walter Benjamin about Lukács. He says Lukács and Carella and all those people, he said they don't like production, because that's what art is, production. They can't produce, so they have to manage. So everything they say is a threat.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Head explode. You know, because one of my very favorite things of Marx, you know, I'm a lover, not a fighter. having just said I'm the assassin, but I'm a person of contradictions, Andy. But in a letter to Adolf Wagner, Marx says that production includes like biting into a peach. He doesn't say biting into a peach, but eating is production, right? Like the thing called pleasure is production. Writing poems is production. But the thing that I learned in theory class that interfaced with Marxism actually was the idea that the work of art is production, and the idea then that some Marxist inspired critics, let's just say, might end up being actually managerial. Like we don't produce people, we just manage they've just gone and reproduced the master slave binary that they've been so adamant about wanting to destroy right there. That's just, wow, my mind's been blown. But you see, this is the interesting thing. To go back to this notion of wonderment, so, the you dirty fucker of academia, my neck of the woods, is words like Jesus and pray, right? But also from the 1960s, when white guys were okay with saying words like Jesus in those days, right? Northrop Frye was an Anglican, Episcopalian, whatever minister, right? And what Northrop Frye would have said was literature's all about life, and life got kind of sidelined and more during theory world, right? Like life became this thing that was all about sort of proto-fascism, right? This is very masculine, essentialistic, that. And the scapegoat actually was the thing they called French feminism, which is really just like philosophy written by French women in the 1960s, yeah. And that was supposed to be biologically essentialist, that I totally dug it. As soon as I started reading it, I had a very strange gap year where, along with working at Lambeth Palace and hugging Desmond Tutu, I read all of Bakhtin, all of Kristeva, Terry Eagleton, and Bart, right? Like this crazy, and a lot of 19th century novels and shit, as they say, and like the idea of. And Leavis, I read a book called The Living Principle, like one of the last things that he wrote. And so for me, autobiographically, and this is in the book, there never was that much of a distinction between the thing called life, which is this kind of quivering, palpitating, D.H. Lawrence talks about it in Why the Novel Matters, this kind of tantric, scintillating, vibrational quality, and theory. I always thought that the theory phenomenology, which is what we're talking about, which is wonderment, is precisely this life, this kind of fascinating quality. And it struck me while learning about meditation that one thing that really happens to you is in your body. There's a way, like you can say mindfulness in university now, but you can't say prana, you can't say nadi, you can't say bindu. All that stuff is crazy talk, right? You certainly can't say it if you're a Hegelian, because you're all about subject and object, and things like subtle body and nadi and whatever affect is coming close to it are like taboo, forbidden. They're not even wrong kind of concepts, right? But that's where all the action is actually. Like, and to me, an awful lot of what appealed to me about theory was that it was like, and this is going to sound crazy, but it was like an eruption. Now I see it with 2020 hindsight, of the Holy Spirit in a totally strange corner of the so-called West, right? Like the whole project of white West and whatever has been a kind of assault on the Holy Spirit in the form of animism, right? Like let's really use this pejorative term to describe people who dare to think that Coke bottles are alive. And, talking of which, what's really bad about capitalism, it's even worse animism than those guys, says Marx, because you actually have installed it into the commodity flow itself, the commodity fetishism. Whether or not you think that Coke bottles are alive, they are effectively alive, and they are your masters, and you're the poor guy who has to price themselves slightly cheaper all the time, whereas the Coke bottle's having all the fun of being priced the right rational price all the time, and you're the slave of these objects, right? You can see why people hate on object-oriented ontology, and it's just sort of like this extra level of irony, because it's like the war against the Holy Spirit could be a way of describing the phenomenology of a lot of Marxism.
I hope
to me.
I hope you write more about this, just because a friend of mine was sort of Marx's professor, retired now, terrific guy, really. But I posted something of yours, and he came in with, oh my God, that Timothy Morton, this idea that things can be sentient or have an existence other than human. If we erase that border, everything falls apart. And it was the animus in him, that you could feel it, how angry he was, that all bets are off then, and I find that extraordinarily interesting that they respond like that.
3 cheers for Freudian slips, or whatever they are, because you said the animus in him, which has to do with animation, right? And like the animus in a way versus the anima, if we're going to be a bit Jungian about it, it's like they're perfectly all right with the hate mode, right? They're perfectly all right with contempt mode, right? In a sense, movement just is the Holy Spirit, folks. Just trust me, I'm writing another book. I'm writing a sequel with my wife Trina called Paradise. It's the sequel to Hell. The subtitle of Hell is In Search of a Christian Ecology. The subtitle of Paradise, which Trina thought up, is A Christian Ecology, right? And we're doing it as a kind of dialogue, right? Like, here's a black woman from Jamaica, here's a white guy from the UK, and we're talking about all this stuff, right? And it strikes me that, where the Holy Spirit can't help but be everywhere, and so in the very animus directed against it, it's there, right? Like it's unstoppable, irresistible force. It's coming out of the concrete. I was at this point, Andy, last year when I basically thought to myself, you know what, Tim, you don't even have to not believe in God. You're so beyond atheism, and you're so even beyond non-theism. You don't even have to not believe. And you've been a Buddhist for so long, you don't even have to not believe in this guy. And I have this very peculiar sensation, this little kind of voice. Like, imagine imagine Johnny Depp is Jesus, right? Like imagine Captain Jack Sparrow as a kind of acid house guy with like a thing. He's like, I'm inside you, mate. I'm doing it. This little voice inside me going, what? You know what that means? You know what that means, don't you, mate? And I'm like, what? Oh, right. And I just sort of let it in to my consciousness what was already the case. It seems to me. And so what's ironic is that a whole bunch of, so theory culminated in, one of the culminations of it was Gloria Anzaldúa, an actual shaman professor at Duke University. And another culmination, and Graham's never going to agree with me on this, was 3 white guys deciding that Coke bottles are people. Right, object-oriented ontology is a huge beneficiary of decades of deconstruction of the Western metaphysics. Basically,
why I've read. So when I was at university, my lecturer, that I had many courses with, was a guy called Alex Kalinikos, who's now on the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party. So he's a Marxist, and I kind of read. In a weird, it was very strange even at the time, actually, but my degree was 80% Marxism and 20% Wittgenstein. And in my own time, I read people like Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, but I never clicked with any of that at all. We seem to be I feel kind of like remiss, really. Somehow I missed out on all of that. But I had read it, but I didn't get its relevance. But I found, when I read OOO stuff, and speculative realism, I think I read some early issues of the Collapse magazine, which had a lot of speculative realist stuff in it, and that made sense to me. So I don't know why this translation made sense to me. Graham Harman does make a lot of sense, but I immediately got what he was on about. I get the connection with French theory, but why is that? Why is that much more?
It's ironic because explicitly a lot of, I'm so sorry about this, Graham, but a lot of explicitly OOO in those days and speculative realism was a huge war against theory, right? Like Irigaray was demonized, actually. The Sokal hoax was lionized as this wonderful thing. I was at NYU when that happened. This physics professor called Alan Sokal got an essay published in Social Text claiming to be an Irigarayan account of quantum gravity, and thereby, so they believed, exposing the whole theory thing as a crock of shit, right? And I was deeply, deeply on Irigaray's side there, and deeply, deeply, actually, that's quite an interesting essay. Of course, they published it in Social Text. Okay, you faked it, whatever, who cares, And so I was a bit chagrined to find that I had this affinity with OOO, who were performing this kind of distaste for the Irigori stuff that had ironically gotten me into the OOO in the first place, right? Right, like I had the same journey as you in an inverse way, right? Namely, when I first encountered OOO, I was like, what the hell is this? What actually is this? Who are these guys getting so mad all the time at everybody on, like, what are they doing? You know, and as I was A plus theory guy and able to like level people, I was thinking, oh, I got to do this. And then I realized this is my truth process, you know, because one of them was kind enough to point out that one of my ideas was exactly their concept of the so-called object. So, oh, okay, I get it, you know. So actually, I had the inverse experience of like growing up in Irigori world, right, and coming to OOO through the back door, and how ironic, because the noise that it seemed to make, along with a lot of speculative realism, was very hostile to supposed theory. You know, so what can I say? I'm a freak, I'm a weirdo. I'm just like, I've constantly been on the edge of and on the outside of things, and it wouldn't occur to anybody else to just randomly pick up Ethel Leavis and Julia Kristeva and read them with equal sincerity in parallel to each other, not really caring about the noise that they made. You know, when I say the noise they made, in a way, what I'm talking about is the topic of this whole discussion, which is the primordial narcissistic inclusion exclusion churning that some people mistake for feeling good, you know, or feeling like real, or feeling, you know, whatever it is, you know. And one of the perverse sort of superpowers of being a very heavy abuse survivor of a psychopath father is knowing in your gut that those things are not actually, that's a feeling. That feeling of inclusion exclusion, that's actually a really, mostly a really sinister feeling, you know, unless it's to do with eating something. And then, you know, because you've got to eat to live, you know, you've got to swallow things and have them in your tummy, and you've got to excrete them to live, right? But like, above and beyond that, don't apply that to like being friends with people or creating a nice just world or whatever. And the bigger scale you get, the more these feelings are going to come out, right? Like the bigger of a planet scale we get these political problems, the more regressed people are going to feel in relation to those scales. They're literally physically smaller than, but also psychologically smaller than. So the unfortunate situation we have right now is that everyone on Earth has been reduced to very small people watching adults abusing their bodies in the form of oil corporations et al., right? And so incredibly primitive stuff is coming up, unbelievable primitive stuff. And people who dare to say, we should try something different and we should form relationships and we should try, get automatically expelled by the whatever side that is, you know, whether it be the pro-capitalist side or the anti-capitalist, whatever kind of team, it's all turning into horrible fascist team sports, right? Because of this dynamic. And I'm damned if it's going to happen on my watch. I'm damned if it's going to happen on my, because this is what happened to me as a small kid. And I recognize it and I know what it is. So I can use those feelings as a kind of superpower to warn people. This has got nothing to do, guys, with like creating a planet scale good stuff. What we need to do is this and this and this and this. And let's look at these things as models where we can kind of scale up this wonderful feeling that we have. For example, when you're meditating, you're in a kind of coexistence with yourself, right? You've got this wonderful sort of physical kind of, everything's kind of evaporating feeling, right? It's like you're coexisting with yourself because you're made out of time. You can coexist with yourself. You can coexist with your neighbor, right? Like when your best person wakes up next to you and goes, I was dreaming. I was dreaming. That's this intimate. You don't know what they were dreaming. You're just they're your neighbor. There's this weird, uncanny. Wow, what were they dreaming? I can't remember. When Martin Luther King stands up in front of millions of people, and this isn't in the book. What's in the book is Martin Luther King forces you to imagine the future being different by saying, "I have a dream." But what I figured out after the book was, as a minister, as someone with charisma, as someone who's connected to the Holy Spirit, he also understands how to be intimate in front of millions of people, both spatially in front of him and in the future, right? Because he just did that to everybody. He stood in front of you like your lover, waking up next to you and going, I'm dreaming, or like they fall asleep, they're falling asleep, that I'm having a dream. And it's this very vulnerable moment. You could kill them, you could strangle them. They're only half awake. And they're telling you, I'm having a dream. To be able to do that, to create a world in which it's okay for someone to be 2 inches from your face and go, I'm dreaming. That's what I want to do. That's my kind of world. I want to create a world where, like, cows and cats, as well as human beings, can have that, like, non-violent, that radical non-violence, where I'm not going to hurt them when they go, oh, I'm having a dream.
Tim, thank you for that. I mean, we've had such a long discussion. I have to wind it up, not because there was nothing else to talk about, but because I feel that we could have gone on forever. I actually had more questions to ask you, so I won't formally invite you now, but at some point I hope to drag you back on this podcast so you can answer all these questions I had about all sorts of things, you know. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you for writing the Hell book, because it was I was so much looking forward to reading it. I had kind of set it up that, you know, this, and it was going to be a bit, I don't know what the feeling was, but anyway, I was really looking forward to it. And the only criticism, it's not a criticism, but the only criticism I have from a Blakean point of view is that although you talk about Blake all the way through it, it's illustrative of this wider point. It's such an important book generally that it doesn't come across as a book about Blake studies. It comes across as a Blakean book, which is a much finer thing in my mind. But, you know, I do think certainly for followers of Blake, it's really the most important book written in that vein for a generation. I think it's the book I've found most important in the Blakean tradition. So it's such an honor to be here talking to you again tonight after having read your book. So thank you very much, Tim. I know we'll be speaking again. I hope to see you, by the way. This is going out before it's the 13th of June, isn't it? That you're in the old church up in Stoke Newington for a book launch of Hell. So that's the 13th of June. So I shall certainly be seeing you there, and I hope of our listeners there as well. So please do join us. But in the meantime, everybody, don't forget to subscribe to The Traveller in the Evening, as they say. And Tim, yes?
If I could say one more thing, just to echo. First of all, thank you for formally, informally, not formally re-inviting me. I would love to do this again. It's been absolutely lovely. Just in terms of fomenting some kind of real, actual group dynamics, actually, between you and me and other people, that we can sort of model this for other people, yeah? You know, I'm a freak, and like I know something about groups because of that. And like, so Victor Shklovsky, I believe, talking of theory, one thing we had to do was study the Russian formalists right at the very beginning. I think it was him who said Tristram Shandy was the most typical novel ever written because it never gets off the ground. And this conversation started, it kind of didn't even start. It was like we basically talked about the possibility of having the conversation for a very long time. And that's why this crazy Shandy-esque thing has been so lovely to do. And I'm so grateful to you for being my pal and for having me on the podcast and for talking so nicely and so touchingly about my book. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and I can't wait for whatever it is, stage 3, 4, whatever that is of our interactions.
Brilliant. From a fellow freak, thank you, Tim.